My new job is much more international than any of my other jobs before. Immigrants all over the world work at my job, and you get some seriously varied views on issues that go completely counter to the scientific data. The discussion started with talking about the girl who was dragged from her desk by the South Carolina cop. They agreed that there was something wrong with the cop, but they blamed cops being in the classroom in the first place when spanking was banned in schools. There were a collection of individuals in the break room, Panamanian, Filipino, and Korean. All of them agree that one of the big problems with American kids was the lack of spanking. I tried to explain that science and psychology says the exact opposite, and they looked at me like I was crazy. But as it was a job situation and quickly showed signs of becoming heated, I fell silent and actively avoided further discussion. They could all cite anecdotes of bad parents who didn't spank, and claim that your child has to fear you to respect you, but they were oblivious to the many cases of good parents who didn't spank. One of the things they all held dear was that they had all been spanked, and they had turned out okay, holding on to the belief so tightly because it was part of their identity that was being under attack when you used science. They claimed that the third world was better in this case because they respected their parents through threat of violence, even though crime and violence is statistically so much higher in traditionally third world nations. I discussed the problems of too large class size, and the Korean man took offense to that, asking how big our classes were, and I said 30 for one teacher, and he proudly said they had 50 for one teacher, and if we didn't, we were beaten and we learned. Science shows they learned enough not to get beaten, but they never developed a love of learning. Nor did they learn to think outside the box, and the spanking and the fear of spanking actually dropped their IQ some and made them much more deferring to authority, and much more open to abuse, and likely to use violence as a solution to problems. Someone claimed that spanking made you more able to deal with pain in the real world, some experience you can get from just being able to play outside and get hurt. West Virginia coal miners have been shown to have some kind of pride in their crappy jobs and poor treatment, which leads to early death, which acts like a defense to cognitive dissonance, to a really crappy job that they wouldn't do it if they didn't love it and have pride in it, so they convince themselves they love it even if they could die any day. Developing respect does not require physical pain, or even the threat of physical pain. Humans, especially children, are very pack-oriented, similar to dogs, and feel a deep desire to know their position in the pecking order, and will always push boundaries and limits, but ultimately fall in line to authority when dominance is presented. Physical violence is a way of establishing dominance, but is not the best or only way, despite what many believe. Attitudes, mannerisms, attention denial, and consistency are other methods of establishing dominance. This allows you to use cognitive conditioning so they don't need to have dominance used against them. The problem is that the anti-spanking data isn't countered with alternatives to spanking, and you end up with hippie or naive ideals about parenting, and the kids pretty much control the adults, ending up with spoiled kids. These are the same people who are bad pet owners who cater to their pets' every whim, and don't realize the strong desire a dog has to know their place in the pack, and if you don't assert yourself as alpha, they are automatically alpha. I wish that prior to having children it was mandatory to take a dog training class. These classes train the owners just as much as they train the dog. The South Park episode on Cartman having a dog whisperer as a nanny is dead on. I discuss this whole subject in more detail in my series Training Your Inner Beast. Aside from dominance, there are other things you can do to increase control while letting them grow up curious. Giving them the appearance of and practice with choice over little things allows them to remain assertive while you are still in control. As they get older, the need for dominance wanes if established early, and trusting them to get practice being adults will increase. Spanking has been shown to only work in short term, but long term the conditioning effects wear off. Other punishments are much better. It has been shown to reduce IQ, and it encourages the use of violence as an option. It also increases the need to add more and more restrictions to control them, because thanks to lowered IQ and feeling trapped, they are more likely to try and rebel further, especially in their teen years when their hormones demand independence. It becomes a vicious cycle, to the point that US kids have slightly more rules and less freedom than prisoners, and slightly less than Marines in boot camp. This uber control increases depression, decreases their ability to cope with adulthood and independence when they get out. The same psychology that says don't spank also has options and alternatives that often requires changing yourself, which is difficult when you're currently a parent and are busy trying to just keep up with your kids. People at that point in time might continue to need to keep spanking until they can figure out other alternatives to maintain basic sanity, especially if the child is hurting someone else and needs a jolt of simulated empathy, or is doing something that could harm themselves. People tell me that since I'm not a parent, my tune will change when I have kids, and I'll admit, I can't promise I will be perfect, but I've seen the techniques used repeatedly on both dogs and children, and they have never needed to be spanked, and are polite, obedient, yet independent thinkers. I will not judge someone who spanks unless it crosses over into child abuse, because they have probably been fed the line, spare the rod and spoil the child, and they have seen plenty of examples of bad spankless parents, while they're probably oblivious that they know kids and parents that don't spank, because to have a kid that well behaved that wasn't spanked would be impossible. It's binary to them, and they do not realize that there is another way that actually works. However, using "we turned out all right" is not a reason to do anything. People have been molested as kids, and they turned out as functioning adults, though probably not as high-functioning as if they hadn't been molested. It feels like an attack on one's identity, and that's the problem. As Keith Lowell Jensen put it, I have friends who say, "We got hit, and we were kids, remember? We got hit." Then I have to have that awkward conversation where I explain that we are not what I'm aiming for.